Hannah and Ethan Green were the kind of siblings who seemed inseparable. But behind their quiet smiles and small-town charm hid a forbidden secret so disturbing it would shatter their family, horrify their community, and end in a brutal murder that no one saw coming. In the quiet rural town of Larkspur, Montana, life moved slowly. Surrounded by dense pine forests and far from the noise of cities most families kept to themselves, everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. That illusion shattered the day Hannah Green returned home. She was 23, strikingly beautiful, and carried herself with quiet confidence. After 5 years away in Seattle, her sudden arrival surprised even her parents. No one knew what had pulled her back to the family's worn farmhouse on the edge of town. Her younger brother, Ethan, was now 20. He had always been shy, soft-spoken, and often lost in his own world. In Hannah's absence, he had grown more withdrawn. He spent most of his time reading alone or taking long walks in the woods that bordered their property. But the moment Hannah walked through the door, something in Ethan changed. Their reunion was emotional, but it didn't take long for people to notice how close they had become. In the first week, they were seen together constantly. At the grocery store, at the creek, in the backyard late at night, always alone, always talking in hushed tones. At first, their closeness was brushed off as the bond of siblings reconnecting, after years apart. But with each passing day, something about their relationship felt off. They began excluding others. If their parents asked to join them on a walk, the siblings would make excuses. Hannah refused to sleep in her old room instead, choosing to stay in Ethan's. They claimed it was just temporary, just until she adjusted to being back home. But weeks went by, and nothing changed. One afternoon, their mother, Susan, came home early from work and found them curled up under a blanket in the living room. The TV was off. They weren't watching anything. They separated quickly when she walked in, too quickly. From that moment, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Their father, Paul, dismissed her concerns. He said they were just close, that the family should be grateful Hannah was home and Ethan seemed happier. But Susan became more and more disturbed. The hugs between Hannah and Ethan lasted too long. Their whispers stopped whenever someone entered the room. And Ethan had started skipping his college classes, preferring to stay home with Hannah. As months passed, Hannah showed no interest in finding a job or resuming her old life. She didn't reconnect with old friends. She hardly left the house unless Ethan was with her. Their parents tried to act like everything was normal, but the unease became unbearable. Even the neighbors began to talk. Mrs. Calhoun from next door mentioned how she'd seen the siblings walking hand in hand in the woods behind the house, like lovers. Another neighbor swore she saw them kissing through a window late one night. Still, without proof, there was little anyone could do. The whispers remained just that, whispers. Then something changed in Susan. She stopped speaking to her children. She cooked and cleaned like always, but never said a word to them. Her once warm, cheerful demeanor turned cold. She avoided eye contact, avoided the dinner table, avoided the living room. Eventually, without explanation, she packed a bag and Paul was heartbroken, confused, and too proud to ask her why. He believed she was going through a phase, that she'd return, but deep down Susan had seen something she could never unsee, something so terrible it drove her from her home without a word. Left alone, the house grew even more tense. Paul drank more, stayed out longer, and tried to ignore the reality creeping in through every crack in the floorboards. And in that silence, Ethan and Hannah continued their quiet descent into secrecy. No one truly knew what had taken root between them. But one thing was certain. Something deeply unnatural was growing in that house, hidden behind locked doors and shuttered windows, waiting to destroy everything in its path. After their mother left, the greenhouse changed in ways that words couldn't fully explain. The warmth and order that once kept the family steady disappeared. Without Susan's presence, there was no structure, no rules, and no one to question anything. Paul spent most of his days drinking in the den or working long shifts to avoid coming home. His silence and denial left a vacuum, and in that empty space, Ethan and Hannah's relationship deepened into something far more dangerous. With no eyes on them, the siblings no longer pretended to live separate lives. Hannah remained in Ethan's bedroom full-time. They began eating meals alone, away from their father. On the rare occasions they joined Paul at the table, the tension was unbearable. Paul would mumble something about his job or the weather, but neither Ethan nor Hannah responded. Instead, they exchanged glances only they could understand. Then, without explanation, they'd disappear upstairs again. The sounds of the house changed too. Doors creaked open in the middle of the night, soft footsteps pattered across the floor at odd hours, and sometimes the muffled thump of movement echoed through the walls when the rest of the world was asleep. What began as secret touches and lingering stares had evolved into something physical, something intimate. It wasn't love. It was obsession, twisted, forbidden, and impossible to escape. They convinced themselves no one would understand. The fear of being discovered only made the connection more intense. They stopped seeing themselves as brother and sister. In their minds, they were soulmates. The rules didn't apply to them. Ethan stopped communicating with anyone outside the house. He deleted his social media accounts, stopped returning texts, and ignored phone calls. His college officially withdrew him after months of absence. Meanwhile, Hannah's old friends tried reaching out, but she never responded. She'd changed her number, claiming she wanted to start over. But starting over for Hannah meant cutting off the entire outside world to live in this strange and isolated version of reality with Ethan. They created a new life in the basement of the house. What used to be a storage area filled with old furniture and boxes became their personal space. They added a mattress, strung fairy lights across the ceiling, and even brought down a space heater to survive the freezing Montana nights. They told Paul they were cleaning up the space, and he, in his drunken fog, never questioned it. Most nights, he didn't even notice they weren't sleeping in their rooms. In that basement, time stopped. They stayed awake until morning, lying side by side, writing in notebooks, sharing their darkest thoughts. They planned a future that didn't exist, far away from Larkspur. Somewhere they could live as they pleased, where no one would know who they were or what they had done. They talked about escaping, starting over with new names, maybe even leaving the country. But for now, they stayed hidden, feeding off secrecy and fantasy. The secrecy, however, began to weigh on Hannah. Despite her attachment to Ethan, cracks started to form in her thoughts. She knew what they were doing wasn't right, that it couldn't last. She began writing in a journal, filling pages with confusion, guilt, and fear. She didn't show Ethan these entries. In her mind, it was the only piece of herself that still belonged to her alone. Then came the turning point. One day, while Ethan was outside chopping wood, Hannah sat in the kitchen staring at her phone. A news article about a similar case involving incest and arrest had gone viral. The couple had been sentenced to prison. Something shifted in Hannah as she read the details. For the first time, she imagined what it would be like to be exposed, to see her name plastered across headlines, to be labeled and judged. She pictured her father's shame, the community's reaction, the police questioning her. Her chest tightened, and the fantasy began to collapse. She considered telling someone. Just one person. Not everything. Just enough to find a way out. But before she could act, Ethan walked back in, cold air rushing through the doorway, and she quickly closed the browser and smiled like nothing had changed. Deep down, though, something had. The days grew darker in Larkspur as autumn settled in, bringing colder winds and longer nights. The trees shed their leaves, and the town seemed to retreat into itself. In the Green household, a quiet storm brewed beneath the surface. Paul remained, a ghost of his former self, drinking more heavily, barely speaking, and wandering around the property as if he no longer knew where he belonged. He had grown used to the strange silence in the house, but the tension that pulsed between Hannah and Ethan had become too thick to ignore. Paul occasionally caught glimpses of them in the basement or upstairs, sitting unnaturally close or whispering in corners. He chalked it up to his imagination and the haze of alcohol that constantly blurred his vision. He didn't want to believe there was anything more sinister going on. Denial was easier than facing the truth, and Paul had long since chosen the path of least resistance. But he wasn't blind. He noticed the way Hannah flinched when Ethan touched her, how her smile had faded, and how something hollow had taken root in her eyes. Hannah had started withdrawing more and more. The journal she kept was now filled with desperation and dread. Each page bled with the anxiety she couldn't voice aloud. She felt trapped, imprisoned in a life she never intended to live. Her earlier fantasies of escaping with Ethan had turned to nightmares. The once thrilling secrecy now felt suffocating. She started locking herself in the bathroom for hours, just to be alone. She would sit on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, trying to remember who she was before any of this began. Ethan, on the other hand, sensed her growing distance and panicked. He became more controlling, more intense. If she went for a walk alone, he'd follow. If she avoided his gaze, he'd confront her. He asked what she was thinking, what she was hiding, why she seemed different. She told him she was tired, that the cold weather made her gloomy, but the lies didn't convince him. Something had shifted, and Ethan couldn't bear the thought of losing what they had built. One night, Hannah attempted to call someone, an old friend from Seattle, but Ethan walked in before she could finish dialing. He stared at the phone in her hand, then at her, and without a word, walked back out. From that moment on, she never left her phone unattended. She started sleeping with it under her pillow, afraid he might look through it. Meanwhile, Paul began finding strange things, small signs that the truth was beginning to surface. A discarded photograph in the trash of Ethan and Hannah embracing, a note tucked under the couch cushion with the words, "We can't live like this anymore," and, worst of all, an entry in Hannah's journal that had fallen behind the washing machine. It wasn't signed, but Paul recognized the handwriting. The words were fragmented and raw, a confession filled with shame, fear, and longing to escape. His heart pounded as he read the short passage. He dropped the paper, his hands trembling. That night, Paul didn't drink. He sat silently in the living room, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. The realization crushed him. Something unnatural was happening in his home, and he had let it grow in the dark. For the first time in months, he confronted the truth, but he didn't know what to do with it. His thoughts twisted between rage, guilt, and helplessness. Upstairs, Hannah lay awake in bed. She knew Ethan was still awake too, lying beside her. In silence, she could feel his tension, his unease. In her mind she rehearsed how she might leave. She thought about packing a bag, sneaking out while he slept, catching a bus to anywhere. But every plan ended in fear. Fear of being found, fear of being judged, fear of hurting the only person who claimed to love her. Outside, the wind howled. Through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped sharply. Inside the greenhouse, everything remained still, but the pressure was building. Something was about to break. The breaking point arrived on a bitter December evening, just days before Christmas. Snow had blanketed the town in silence, but the greenhouse felt colder than ever. The furnace had started failing, and the warmth that once filled the home was gone. Hannah stood by the kitchen window, staring at the white-covered fields, her breath fogging the glass. She'd barely spoken to Ethan in 2 days. Their silence wasn't born from peace, but tension, tight and unrelenting, like a thread stretched to its limit. Ethan had noticed the distance and grown increasingly erratic. He searched through Hannah's things when she wasn't looking. He monitored her every move. The more she pulled away, the harder he clung to the illusion that everything was fine. In his mind, they were still meant to be together. He believed. Their bond was unique, powerful, something the world could never understand, but something they had to protect at any cost. And if she was drifting, it meant someone, or something, was pulling her away from him. Hannah's journal was no longer safe. She had hidden it in different places, terrified Ethan would find it. In it, her thoughts had turned darker. She wrote about escape, about betrayal, and worst of all, about telling someone everything. The more Ethan watched her, the more she feared he knew. And if he did, what would he do? Paul, meanwhile, had slipped into a different kind of silence. After discovering the torn journal entry weeks before, he'd tried to pretend he hadn't seen it, but it haunted him. He watched his children closely now, quietly observing their behavior. He noticed how they avoided others, how they moved like shadows in the house. One morning, he found Hannah crying in the bathroom, her sobs muffled by running water. She didn't know he had heard. Paul paced the hallway that night, unsure of whether to confront them or call the authorities. He was paralyzed by shame and fear. How could he let this happen in his own home? Then, the moment came. It was past midnight when Hannah made her move. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, drunk and exhausted after another argument. She crept upstairs, clutching the small backpack she had packed earlier, just a change of clothes, her journal, and a few $100s she had secretly saved. She opened the front door quietly, flinching as it creaked. The cold air struck her face, biting and real. She stepped outside into the snow, her boots crunching softly. Her heart raced. She didn't look back. But Ethan woke up. Something stirred him from his sleep. Maybe it was the cold draft. Maybe it was the silence. He sat up groggily and saw the door ajar. Panic hit him like a wave. He rushed outside barefoot, calling her name into the frozen darkness. His voice echoed across the empty field. He spotted her halfway down the driveway, moving fast toward the road. He ran. She heard him and began to run too, slipping slightly on the icy path. Her lungs burned. She didn't stop, even when she heard his footsteps closing in. But Ethan was faster. Fueled by desperation and rage, he caught up just before she reached the gate. He grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her backward. They fell into the snow, a chaotic tangle of limbs and shouts. Hannah screamed for him to let go, tears freezing on her face. Ethan pleaded, then threatened, his voice cracking. She clawed at him, trying to escape, but he wouldn't let her go. Not again. Not ever. Then Paul appeared. Drawn by the noise, he had followed them. He saw them fighting in the snow, his son gripping Hannah tightly. Her face twisted in terror. For the first time he saw everything clearly. The truth he had avoided was now undeniable. Paul shouted, ran toward them, fists clenched. What happened next was a blur. Rage, panic, chaos, and then blood in the snow. The snow around the greenhouse was no longer pure. Crimson streaks stained the white surface, a horrifying contrast to the peaceful winter scene. Paul stood frozen, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. Ethan lay motionless on the ground, his arm twisted beneath him. Hannah knelt beside him, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands trembling and covered in blood. The knife Paul had grabbed from the kitchen, intended only to threaten or separate, had found its mark in the chaos. No one had planned for it to end this way. Yet here they were, surrounded by silence and cold. Hannah kept whispering that she hadn't meant for this to happen. Her face was pale, lips blue from cold and shock. Paul slowly sank to his knees, staring at his son's lifeless body. A deep, primal cry escaped him, echoing across the empty fields. The sound was not just grief. It was guilt, horror, and disbelief, all rolled into one. For years he had failed them, turned a blind eye, let rot fester inside the walls of their home. Now one child was dead and the other was shattered beyond repair. They stayed outside until the cold became unbearable. Paul finally guided Hannah back into the house. She moved like a ghost, barely aware of her surroundings. Paul wrapped her in a blanket and sat her by the fire, then called the police with trembling hands. His voice cracked as he tried to explain what had happened, and for a moment he thought the dispatcher might not believe him. But the words eventually came. A domestic dispute, a stabbing, one dead. The authorities arrived within minutes. The snow muffled the sound of their sirens until they were practically at the door. The flashing lights cast a surreal glow through the windows. Officers moved quickly, securing the scene, asking questions. An ambulance came too, though there was nothing they could do for Ethan. A coroner was called instead. As his body was lifted into a black bag, Hannah turned her face away and began to weep again. Inside, Paul gave a full statement, telling the truth without embellishment. He admitted what he had seen, what he had suspected, and what had finally driven him to intervene. He told them how he had tried to pull Ethan off Hannah, how the knife had somehow slipped in the scuffle. His voice was low and broken. The officers exchanged looks but said little. The story was strange, deeply unsettling, but the evidence supported his claims. Still, it would be the investigators who decided whether the stabbing was self-defense, manslaughter, or something else entirely. Hannah was taken in for questioning too, wrapped in the same blanket, her eyes hollow. She spoke calmly, too calmly. Her voice carried none of the emotion on her face. The trauma had pushed her past the edge of fear. She described how it had started, what their relationship had become, and how she had tried to leave. Her confession was disturbing, layered in years of secrecy and shame. The detectives listened carefully, their pens moving slowly. They had heard dark stories before, but something about this one settled heavily in the room. In the days that followed, Larkspur buzzed with rumors. The Green family had always been seen as private but respectable. Now whispers of incest, murder, and mental unraveling filled the air like wildfire. Neighbors avoided eye contact at the grocery store. The church issued statements about healing and forgiveness, but few could ignore the horror of what had been uncovered. The greenhouse sat quietly at the edge of town, dark and empty, a symbol of everything unspoken. Paul was never charged. The death was officially ruled accidental in the course of a domestic disturbance, though investigators made no public comment about the disturbing revelations surrounding Ethan and Hannah. Hannah was taken to a treatment facility out of state. The details of her mental state were kept private, but it was clear she needed care more than punishment. The town tried to move on, but nothing felt the same again. Snow fell through January and into February, covering the past but not erasing it. Beneath it all, the tragedy remained, buried but never forgotten.